Hello, my dear friends. If you once believed that medieval women always appeared with glossy hair, fragrant dresses, and a mythical kind of beauty, then prepare yourself, because the truth is very different. And as always, I'm deeply grateful that you've taken the time to accompany me through these stories that are a little strange, yet incredibly fascinating. So before we begin, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I share here. If you're watching this video from anywhere in the world, leave a comment to let me know your location and your local time. Now turn off the lights, wrap yourself in a warm blanket, and let's ease our way into tonight's journey together. From the very moment you open your eyes in the medieval world, you're forced to live with a strange truth that the entire society believed in completely. Water is something that both keeps you alive and can kill you. And according to the beliefs of that era, it was more likely to cause illness than to clean. Every drop of water was suspected of containing miasma, the poisonous air that medieval people believed to be the cause of epidemics, fevers, and every other invisible misfortune. That made bathing something you, if born a woman, would have to consider very carefully, sometimes only once a year. The church, physicians, and mothers of earlier generations all agreed in advising women to stay away from immersing themselves in water. Not because they hated cleanliness, but because they feared the cold seeping through the skin, feared the pores opening up and letting toxic air into the body. Some medical texts of the time even wrote that bathing too often made the blood thin, weakened the spirit, and made women more easily corrupted. So when you hear that most medieval women bathed only 2 to 4 times a year, don't be quick to assume they were lazy. They believed it was saving their lives. You live in a small wooden house with a thatched roof, with the winter wind slipping through every gap. To have water for bathing, you must scoop it from the river, where humans, animals, and waste all share the same source, then heat it over a smoky charcoal stove. Not to mention, warm water only stays warm for a few minutes, and taking off all the heavy layers of clothing in winter is no different from willingly catching a chill. Cleanliness suddenly becomes a luxury your body can hardly afford. And even when you dare to bathe, it is difficult to keep it secret. Villagers can easily tell when someone has just stepped out of a bath from the damp hair or steam on the skin. Immediately they would ask if you felt dizzy, if you were coughing, if you had a headache, as though you had just done something as reckless as climbing up the bell tower and using the bell rope as a swing. Bathing was a more public event than you think, almost a declaration that you were challenging death itself. In some regions, people even believed that a woman became more easily possessed after bathing, because water washed away the natural oils that God had given to protect the body from evil air. These strange beliefs were not limited to commoners. Even queens and noblewomen did not bathe more often. Queen Isabella of Castile, powerful enough to determine the fate of an entire kingdom, was famous for bathing only twice in her life, when she was born and on her wedding day. You're not meant to laugh at this, but to understand that medieval women lived in a world where cleaning oneself sometimes smelled of danger. Bathing less did not mean they did not want to be clean. They simply had no choice but to use other methods. But with the body exposed to mud, smoke from the hearth, charcoal dust, sweat, and many layers of clothing throughout the year, the result was a kind of signature scent that the modern world can hardly imagine. Records from this era describe the smell of medieval people as strong, thick, and persistent, a scent made of smoke, cooking fat, sweat glands, and the weather. Even in some monastic documents, nuns complained that when a pregnant or seriously ill woman was forced to bathe in warm water, the smell rising from her body was as if months were escaping at once. That was not an insult, but an honest reflection of an age that did not know fragrant soap or hot showers. Ironically, in the eyes of medieval people, the lack of bathing did not make them feel dirty. It made them feel safe. The less you bathed, the lower your chance of falling ill. The less you fell ill, the easier it was to keep living. As simple as that. Cleanliness was a moral and spiritual concept rather than a physical one. No one judged a woman for smelling of sweat, but they would judge her silence if she did not go to church. It was not that they did not want to smell pleasant, but that the entire world around them was against it. Water was not the body's friend. It was only safe when boiled for drinking or used to wash cooking pots. As for bathing, that was reserved for special occasions, weddings, childbirth, or when a physician ordered it. And physicians of that era had reasons that were often hard to explain. Therefore, if a medieval woman lived to the age of 40, in a time when the average life expectancy was only around 35, it was proof of her skill in avoiding unnecessary risks. And bathing, ironically, was considered one of those risks. When you step out of this historical threshold and return to the modern world, perhaps you will find it difficult to blame them. They were not dirty in the way we once imagined. They were simply trying to survive in an era that believed cleanliness meant disaster, and body odour was as natural as the sound of a rooster crowing at dawn. In the darkness of the medieval world, where death lurked at every doorstep, sometimes not bathing was the way one held on to life, and women, as usual, were the ones who had to endure it the most. If you think that not bathing means giving up on hygiene, medieval people would gently place a hand on your shoulder and say, "Not at all. We have linen." In a world where water was seen as a danger, women could not rely on baths, but they placed absolute trust in that pale, smooth, cool fabric. Linen was not just cloth. To them it was a shield against dirt, a natural filter for the body, something that could replace the entire process of cleaning the skin with imagined science. The idea was very simple. Linen absorbs sweat, oil, and dust, and therefore everything unclean clings to the fabric instead of clinging to the body. You change your linen, you automatically dry bathe. Everything happens like magic, in a way medieval people believed was entirely sufficient to keep the body clean without touching water. And strangely enough, that belief lasted for centuries, to the point where noble women spent hours each morning changing 2 or 3 layers of linen, one on top of another, as though building a living filtration system directly on their skin. Try stepping into the changing room of a woman from the upper class. Light filtering through a small window, an empty wash basin, no fragrant soap, no perfumes. Instead, there is a stack of pristine linen, washed, dried, and carefully ironed. Each piece of linen was seen as a new bath. It sounds delicate, even convenient. No one in that society found it strange. On the contrary, the more frequently you changed your linen, the more you were viewed as wealthy and properly self-caring. But that was only the story of those with money. If you were born in a poor household on the outskirts of a medieval town, your linen shirt, if you had one, would cling to your body for weeks, sometimes months. Linen was expensive and washing was not an easy task. So for the poor, that layer of linen became part of their very skin. It absorbed sweat, dust, soot from the hearth, children's saliva, and no one had any intention of changing it unless it had turned yellow or had torn to the point of being unpatchable. You can imagine the feeling of wearing a layer of linen that has not been changed for months, a pungent scent, a mix of kitchen smoke, oil, sweat, and the weather. But for medieval women, that was the natural smell, the smell of life. In fact, some monastic writings describe the poor as wearing their linen like a second skin, something that nature, or God, had given them to protect against cold winds and illness. The degree to which linen absorbed moisture meant their bodies were always wrapped in a thin film of dampness and dust, which was considered beneficial. Medieval women genuinely believed that linen kept them cleaner. Thus, noblemen washed their linen constantly, but their outer garments were rarely cleaned because thick fabrics were expensive. They tended to the inner layer, the one in direct contact with the skin, the way modern people care for their most luxurious skincare routine. As for the long outer gowns that dragged across the ground, collecting mud and dirt, as long as the linen beneath was clean, it was fine. Because of this, many records from the period describe the sight of pristine white linen peeking out beneath filthy skirts, cleanliness and dirt existing together in a single outfit, making the medieval woman appear both elegant and scented with life. Linen was also used as a tool against sweat. Medieval people had no deodorant, and they believed that the body produced sweat to purify the blood. But if sweat was not absorbed quickly, it would cause illness. Therefore, women sewed small linen pouches inside their underarms to absorb sweat. A handmade version of armpit pads, unscented but highly effective by the standards of the time. When the linen pouch changed colour, they simply replaced it without needing to remove the entire outfit. Of course, none of this was clean in the modern sense. Linen had its limits. A layer of cloth constantly absorbing oil, dust, and sweat became a breeding ground for bacteria, lice, and even fungal infections. But when medical knowledge revolved solely around toxic air and scripture, women had no reason to doubt this dry bathing method. In their eyes, linen was the most reasonable solution in an age lacking clean water, soap, bathrooms, and even the freedom to care for themselves in safer ways. Interestingly, even ancient medical documents regarded linen as a gift from God. People believed that linen soothed the skin, absorbed moisture, prevented illness, and created modesty. And so women associated linen with purity, propriety, and femininity, regardless of the reality beneath that difficult-to-describe layer. When you look at the society as a whole, you understand why linen became the central hygiene tool in a woman's life. It was the barrier between her and the dirty world outside, the one thing anyone could use, if they could afford it, and the thing that allowed women to feel clean, even if their bodies had not touched a drop of water for weeks. Some records even describe noblewomen changing linen so many times a day that their servants had to keep washing batches of it non-stop, unable to dry them all in time. In the darkness of an age where people believed water could kill them, linen became a solution that was safe, economical, and, in some sense, truly creative. It did not clean the body in the way we understand today, but it made women of the time believe they were doing the right thing to protect their health. And sometimes in history, belief is stronger than truth. In the medieval era, you could lack many things: clean water, soap, bathhouses, the concept of bacteria, but you certainly could not lack smell. Body odour was an essential part of life, like kitchen smoke or the sound of church bells. For women, smell was not just a trace of labour and weather. It was a silent challenge everyone recognised, yet collectively covered up with a thin veil of herbs. When you see a noble woman walking out of a city gate wearing layered gowns and a pristine head covering, that hazy elegance is actually built upon a far more complex odour defence system than you might think. Without deodorant, without spray perfumes, and certainly without daily soap, medieval women had to rely on whatever nature offered. And nature, in their eyes, was generous. Roses, lavender, thyme, rosemary, all were stuffed into small linen pouches, hung inside clothing, attached to belts, or hidden in sleeves. When you approached a woman of that time, the first thing you smelled was not her body, but the faint scent of dried herbs, like opening the door to a midsummer herb garden. But just one strong gust of wind could blow away the disguise. Interestingly, medieval people did not hate body odour. They only feared the sensation of a smell being too strong and making others uncomfortable. Society did not view body odour as a sign of poor hygiene. On the contrary, it was normal. What was considered abnormal was trying to bathe too often or be too clean, something seen as somewhat dangerous. So instead of eliminating smells, they covered them. And this is where you meet the most important accessory of the era, the pomander, the small scented ball that women were required to carry when entering church. In records from the 13th, 14th centuries, the church believed foul odours were pathways for bad air to enter, making the mind more vulnerable to temptation. Therefore, women entering sacred space had to carry a pomander, a small silver, bronze or wooden ball filled with dried herbs, pine resin, myrrh resin, or a few drops of citrus oil. If you held a pomander in your hand, you would find it carved as delicately as jewellery, yet its function was entirely mundane, to mask the scent of its owner. For the wealthy, scent covering became an art. They rubbed rose oil on their wrists, smoothed olive oil mixed with rosemary into their hair, and hid small herb pouches inside their gowns so fragrance would waft out with every movement. But you will notice the irony of history. They wanted to smell pleasant, but did not bathe enough for their bodies to be truly clean. The result was a mixture of floral scents and body odour, creating a medieval signature fragrance described by people of the time as indescribable but familiar. The poor, of course, could not afford rose oil or imported lavender. They used more practical, and sometimes more unpleasant, options. Animal fat was extremely popular. Rubbing fat on the skin helped keep warm in winter and formed a protective layer against the wind. But fat, as you know, does not stay pleasant smelling for long. To improve the situation, they mixed it with herbs, pine resin, or fine ash. The result was a scent difficult to predict, smoky, fatty, and herbal. A smell the village recognized instantly, and strangely, no one found it unusual. Monastic records from the period describe scenes of women sitting round the hearth, rubbing herbal oil or animal fat on their arms and legs, while children slept nearby, surrounded by the smell of sour milk and kitchen smoke. Together, it created a setting so distinctive that one sniff would tell you were inside a 12th century home. In some cases, women even carried bunches of thyme or fresh flowers to stuff under their armpits on hot days. It did not last long, but during festivals where hundreds of bodies crowded together, a sprig of herbs under the arm was enough for someone to feel they were making an effort towards civilization. Naturally, these methods of scent masking could not withstand time. Long days working in fields, cooking over open fires, washing clothes by the river, all made herbal fragrance last only a few hours. But medieval women never saw scent covering as avoidance. To them, it was the only way to maintain a bit of dignity, a bit of decency, especially in a society that judged women harshly, yet gave them no tools to take care of themselves safely. For noble women, pleasant fragrance was also a status symbol. A girl living in a castle would enter a room like a moving bouquet of dried flowers, not because she was cleaner, but because she had the money to cover herself more thoroughly. Stand near them and you would notice it. The white linen, the thick gown, the soft scent of herbs. But beneath all that was a body experiencing the same conditions as everyone else. Little bathing, much sweating, many layers trapping heat. When you look at the whole picture, the truth becomes clear. Medieval deodorant was not meant to cleanse, but to preserve modesty. No one expected the body to be truly clean. People simply hoped the floral scent would be strong enough to mask the truth beneath. And sometimes, on summer evenings, when a woman walked across the village square carrying the faint scent of lavender, perhaps even she believed that this small elegance was enough to make life feel a little less heavy, even just a little. If there were ever a moment in history that should make you feel grateful for modern shampoo, it would be when you look at how medieval women cared for their hair. Today, you wash your hair with rose scent, soapberry, green tea, or expensive essential oils. But women of the 12th century? They had an entirely different holy mixture. Something that, if you handed it to a modern hair salon, they might call the fire brigade or ring the alarm bell. Let's start with the most basic truth. Medieval women almost never washed their hair. Not because they were lazy, but because they believed that water, especially cold water, weakened the scalp and caused hair to fall out in patches. This belief was not invented out of nowhere. It appears in many medical manuscripts of the time, including Trotula, the most famous medieval medical compendium for women from the 12th century. In it, the author advised that wiping the hair with a soft cloth was more beneficial than pouring unnecessary water on it. Yes, that was the official recommendation. So how often did they wash their hair? Records even show that noblewomen washed their hair only once every few months, while the poor did so depending on whether they had anything to wash with, which was usually nothing. But wait, if they did not use water, how exactly did women clean their hair? This is where history's most unique formulas appear. If you are sitting in a warm room, please brace yourself. Fermented urine was considered an excellent cleanser in the medieval period. Strange, but absolutely true. Urine, after being left for several days to ferment into natural ammonia, was used to wash clothes, remove grease, and, yes, wash hair. You bend over a small wooden tub, steam rising with a pungent smell strong enough to sting your eyes. But to medieval women, this was the scent of cleanliness. Ammonia helped dissolve oil and dirt on the scalp, making the hair feel lighter. Some 14th century medical texts even advised women to use children's urine, because it smelled milder and was purer. No one knows what pure meant in this context, but you can guess. Not pure in the way we understand it today. Wood ash, especially ash from oak or maple, was sprinkled onto the hair to soak up oil. Then the hair was vigorously brushed to remove the mixture of ash and sweat. The result? Drier hair, literally, but also dustier. A woman of that time might walk down the street with hair tinted pale grey like misty snow, not because she was old, but because ash was their multi-purpose cosmetic. But ash did more than absorb oil. It supposedly killed lice. The truth? Lice simply moved elsewhere. This led to a rather humorous note in Le Ménagier de Paris, 1393, where the author advised women to keep a distance when combing hair to avoid spreading lice to one another. A very polite but very necessary recommendation. Of all medieval shampoos, vinegar, vinaigre, was perhaps the most pleasant. It helped clean the scalp, remove oil, and make the hair shinier. Some 13th century manuscripts describe women mixing vinegar with warm water and herbs to rub into their hair. a rare moment when medieval hygiene methods sound somewhat normal. Even so, vinegar could not change the fact that they only washed their hair a few times a year. So imagine how effective it truly was. Now we come to the most intriguing and itch-inducing part. Lice. For medieval women, lice were not a sign of poor hygiene. They were almost natural, a part of life just like rain or winter cold. In many 14th century illustrations, you can see scenes of women sitting on porches combing their hair while another person carefully picks out lice, a social activity in every sense. Lice were so common that there were specialized lice-catching tools made from thin metal. Some noblewomen even employed servants devoted solely to hair care and lice removal. Medical texts of the time recorded treatments that sound very extreme, smearing thick pine resin on the hair and pulling it off to remove the entire nest, rubbing tar oil so that lice would fall off on their own, applying a mixture of sheep fat and sulphur to drive away the itching creatures. It sounds more like termite control technology than human hair care. Despite how horrifying it was, hair was still a source of pride for medieval women. Long, thick, fair hair was the beauty ideal from England to Italy. But imagine hair trailing along the ground, unwashed for months, wrapped in layers of fabric, sometimes coated with fat or vinegar. It became heavy, greasy, tangle-prone, and full of surprises. Therefore, women often braided their hair, twisted it into buns or hid it under cloth, not for beauty, but to keep it from touching everything in the house, in the kitchen and in the fields. During festivals, hair was scented with oils, but scented oils of that time were made from animal fat mixed with herbs. So instead of perfume, you got a faint grilled herb smell as you walked past. Medieval hair was a symbol of a world lacking clean water, lacking basic hygiene, but full of strange beliefs and impressive adaptability. It was the intersection of primitive science, religion, poverty, and beauty ideals. And when you see a woman of that era walking down a stone-paved street, her hair hidden beneath a cloth, you understand that they were not concerned with smelling good or being clean by modern standards. What they cared about was surviving the winter, avoiding illness, and fitting the beliefs of their community. Even so, there was something beautiful, deeply human, in the way they preserved the idea of beautiful hair in a world that was anything but gentle. In telling this story, I'm beginning to feel my scalp itch, but no, there is still more. If there is anything that reflects the deep contradictions in the lives of medieval women, it is their clothing. We often imagine them appearing in splendid flowing gowns, soft and elegant like in illuminated manuscripts. But the truth is much closer to a scented nightmare than to any poetic image. Because if you stood near a medieval woman for just a few seconds, you would understand immediately why churches in that era required the use of perfumes and herbs everywhere. Medieval gowns were long, layered, heavy, and extremely fabric-consuming. And fabric was more expensive than you might think. A decent piece of linen or wool cost the equivalent of several weeks' wages for a labourer. As for silk, it was so costly that only the highest nobility could afford it. For that reason, a dress, even an old one, was considered a valuable asset, and assets should not be washed too often. Washing too frequently would damage the fibres, fade the colours, and weaken the threads, something no one in that era wanted. So medieval women invented an unwritten rule: wash what touches the body, but the outer garments, leave them be. Thus, linen undergarments, soft, cheaper, and quick to dry, were washed regularly, but the outer gowns were almost never touched by water. Many noble women proudly declared that their outer dresses could live through 4 seasons without ever being washed. Pride, of course, only makes sense in the context of that era. But imagine this. In winter, they wore 3 layers of gowns. In summer heat, they wore 3 layers of gowns. Working in the fields? Still 3 layers. Attending church? Also 3 layers. Sweat, dust, body oils, kitchen soot, the smell of food, all faithfully absorbed and retained by the dress. And when night fell, as women hung their gowns on wooden beams or metal hooks, it wasn't just fabric being lifted. You could hear a faint rustling, a small but determined sound, signalling the presence of uninvited guests. Bedbugs, wood mites, sometimes even young mice slipping into the folds to escape the cold wind. In the classic work Les Très Riches Heures du Duc de Berry, the illustrator unintentionally recorded the bulky, heavy folds of noble clothing. No one could see the smells or the life teeming within those layers, but administrative records did mention that servants often had to use sticks to beat the hanging gowns to prevent small creatures with legs from sleeping in them overnight. It becomes clear that medieval gowns were not merely garments, they were almost ecosystems. Even clerical records from the period complained about the strong odour in churches, especially in winter when crowds gathered inside and damp wool gowns released vapour. Some churches even scattered herbs around the seating areas to mask the smell of worshippers, something that today sounds more like instructions for sanitising livestock sheds. But the most interesting part is the class difference in how women dealt with this problem. Noble women had a major advantage. They wore fine fabrics, they had fragrances, they had servants to care for their clothes. Yet even with all that, they could not escape the fact that outer gowns were never washed. Instead, they aired gowns in front of the hearth, sprinkled scented powder into the folds, tucked pouches of dried flowers inside the sleeves, applied perfumes made from animal fat and herbs. Let's call this visual cleanliness style, because they looked beautiful and fragrant from afar. But the closer you came, the more the scent of a long day spoke up before the woman had time to open her mouth. The nobility also tended to wear more layers of fabric to display wealth, but the more layers there were, the more space for bedbugs and mites to hide. Some 14th century servant accounts describe having to hang noble women's gowns on tree branches so that sunlight could drive the bugs away. Peasant women had far fewer garments, yet they swept yards, cooked meals, went to the fields, pulled weeds and fed animals, all in the same dress. And that dress might be worn continuously for weeks, months, even half a year if the family was poor. Not washing was not because they didn't want to, but because they owned only 1 to 2 dresses. Thick fabric required too much water. Clean water was a luxury. Fabric took ages to dry. Especially in winter, baths were already rare. Clean clothing was even rarer. Bedbugs and mites living in the fabric became companions. When sleeping, women often hung their dress high, but this sometimes only made it easier for mice to climb in. Some legal documents from 13th century England describe mice chewing through dresses as they crawled inside seeking food or warmth. There was no synthetic perfume, no scented soap, no washing machine, no deodorizer. The only things that could mask odour were dried herbs and animal oils, but these masked smell, they did not remove it. A few descriptions from 14th century Italian merchants wrote that, "When women walk, their gowns carry the breath of earth, of hearth, and of human life." That was the polite wording, the factual wording. Medieval writers were very tactful not to record, but to be fair, women of that era had no other choice. They lived in a world with no clean water, no sanitation, no knowledge of bacteria. They had to cope with whatever they had, and layered gowns were the clearest symbol of that endurance. In the small room steeped in the smell of animal fat and fermented herbs, you sit before a dull bronze mirror, preparing for the beauty ritual that any upper-class medieval woman was expected to perform. There are no safe cosmetics, no medical standards, only the belief that a pale face was a sign of refinement and that any price was worth paying for a properly elegant appearance. A layer of white lead powder, pale as early morning mist, is spread evenly across your skin. The slight stinging sensation now something familiar. Medical notes from that era describe noble faces as white like candle wax, not because it was poetic, but because they used toxic metals every day. The body weakens slowly, hair falling out, headaches, numbness, yet no one thought it came from the box of powder sitting right in front of them. Then comes mercury, the shimmering liquid metal believed to cure freckles. When dabbed onto the skin, it leaves a light heat, then a coolness, and finally an uncomfortable tightening sensation. Others praise your skin for looking brighter, but no one realizes that each layer of peeling skin is a slow sign of poisoning. The trembling hands at feasts, the strained smiles when facial muscles ache, all were considered signs of delicate constitution, and no one dared to suspect the cosmetics lying in their own bags. And then, the eyebrows. You pluck them out one by one, watching your forehead grow higher according to 14th century beauty standards. Some women even shaved part of their hairline to enlarge the forehead, because a high forehead was viewed as aristocratic. After removing all the eyebrows, you take a thin stick of charcoal and redraw a delicate curve. People of the time believed that a face without eyebrows looked purer, nobler, even closer to angelic beauty. No one questioned why angels supposedly had no eyebrows. The smell of the cosmetics is another story entirely. You apply to your face a mixture of goat fat, strong vinegar, and pine oil, a pungent, sharp scent considered high class at feasts. Italian texts from the 14th century wrote that aristocratic fragrance was hard to describe in words, but certainly unrelated to cleanliness. You become accustomed to it to the point you no longer notice, knowing only that if you did not use it, others would think you were neglecting your appearance. In all these rituals, there is one thing you understand clearly. You are not allowed to refuse. Women of this time were taught that beauty was a responsibility, a way to preserve one's position in society. When your body weakens from lead and mercury, no one asks whether you are tired. When your hair falls out by the handful, people simply tell you to change your headscarf. When your hands tremble each morning, you tell yourself you need more sleep, even though the cause is the toxic metals you apply to your skin every day. And so, in the flickering lamplight, you continue the familiar routine: lead powder to brighten the face, mercury to fade freckles, charcoal to redraw the eyebrows you have plucked away. Each step is dangerous, yet each step is considered what a proper woman must do. In this place, beauty is not a joy but a silent negotiation between your body and the unreasonable standards of the age. And you, like every other medieval woman, can only accept it, keep your head held high, and hope that tomorrow the powder on your skin will not make your eyes swell any further. On the days when your body grows heavy and aching, you know you are entering a phase that medieval women rarely named. No one spoke of it at meals, no one brought it into prayer, and certainly no one taught how to care for the body. Menstruation in that era was a secret. Not a noble secret, but the kind hidden away because it was seen as dirty, dangerous, even connected to the devil. Medical texts of the 13th century described menstrual blood as the poisonous vapour of the body, capable of damaging bronze mirrors or rotting flowers with just a light touch. In the heavy atmosphere of such false beliefs, you could not expect any care or guidance. There were no sanitary pads, no clean cloth to change often. You had only old rags called monthly rags tucked between your legs to hold back whatever they could. Some days your body was so exhausted that you abandoned even that layer of cloth, letting the blood soak through the thick gown. Medieval dresses were long, layered, heavy, and dark-coloured, a perfect camouflage for stains no one wanted to see. But the smell could not be hidden. Beneath the folded fabric was moisture, bacteria, sweat, and dried blood. You walked a little more slowly, hoping the cloth would not rub too harshly against the burning skin. In the churches of the time, priests often spoke of the impurity of women, making you feel like a flaw of nature every time your cycle came. But the truth was that every woman in the village experienced the same thing. Your grandmother, your mother, your cousin, the neighbour next door. Some were lucky enough to have a few softer cloths, but most used the same set of rags for several years, rinsed in cold water, hung on a line, then put back into the cycle. Poverty and ignorance made infections far from rare. The burning sensation, swelling, strange sharp smell, all were considered normal. No one thought they were signs of inflammation or disease. Some women chose to avoid using rags altogether, as they were hard to clean and caused irritation. They let the blood flow freely beneath the dress, something described in the texts of the time with the simple phrase, "Nature will take care of it." But nature did not clean. It only allowed bacteria to grow even more under the thick layers of fabric, where air rarely reached. On those days you chose to sit more than walk, hoping your body's weight would keep everything in place. Beyond discomfort, you lived with whispers of superstition. People believed that menstruating women could spoil milk, sour beer, or prevent butter from forming. Some places even forbade women from entering the kitchen during those days, fearing the power of the blood would ruin an entire batch of bread. And you accepted it in silence. Speaking up only made things worse. In the closed space of the house, you tried to soothe your body with herbs, some mugwort, a few rosemary leaves, or warm herbal tea. Older women said they eased the pain, though the effect was little more than a breath of comfort for the spirit. But even that pain you kept to yourself. There were no places for complaints, no days off for menstrual cramps, only farm work, cooking, washing. Everything continued, regardless of how heavy your body felt. And so you passed through those red days like every medieval woman, quietly, secretly, always anxious, yet still carrying on. In that era, menstruation was not seen as natural but as a trial, one that women had to endure alone, with no help, no teaching, and no praise. But it was precisely that silent endurance that formed a strange kind of strength. The strength of women living in a world that did not understand them, yet continuing to make their way through the most difficult processes of the body. Month after month, year after year, as an inevitable part of fate. Within the heavy, thick layers of the gown you're wearing, there is a truth modern people find hard to believe. Underneath, there is almost no fabric covering your body at all. Not because you want it that way, but because medieval women simply did not wear underwear. What modern people consider a basic necessity never existed in your wardrobe. The reason is simple. The gown was already long enough, layered enough, and heavy enough to hide every secret of the body. The upper classes, with their expensive fabric, saw no need to add an extra layer underneath. The lower classes could not afford to waste fabric on an item no one sees. But the price of that freedom was not small. Under layers of linen and wool wrapped tightly from hips to feet, moisture was trapped, sweat could not escape, and the intimate area was always warm, damp, and vulnerable. During days of labour, cooking, or walking through muddy paths, your body became uncomfortable in ways difficult to express. Every step caused the heavy gown to rub against the skin, and there was no fabric in between to cushion that burning friction. People often say medieval women had extraordinary endurance, and it is true. You had to become used to gowns soaked with sweat, soaked with body odour, and on menstrual days, soaked with something else entirely. Many accounts describe how easily women of the time developed infections, yet instead of receiving medical care, the cause was blamed on feminine weakness or divine punishment. No one thought that wearing nothing underneath was part of the problem. Even when late medieval women began using something called braise, a type of tie-on underwear, it was a rare privilege, appearing late and never widespread. Most still lived as you do, relying entirely on the long gown to shield them from the outside world. But the gown could not protect against infection, nor could it provide the ventilation needed for the body to remain healthy. Ironically, external modesty hid an internal struggle. You felt clearly the days your body weakened because the intimate area was constantly moist, the persistent itching and burning because bacteria accumulated, the discomfort spreading every time your work forced you to move more than usual, but you did not speak of it. No one did. It was simply part of life that women had to bear, like carrying water, giving birth, or enduring other pains. And so you continued day after day, living within the long gown society expected you to wear. The women around you were the same, quietly pushing through bodily difficulties that no one acknowledged. Only much later, when modern underwear was invented, did people realize that a small garment could transform comfort, health, and dignity for women. But in the medieval world, you still had to live with heavy layers of fabric while the part of your body that deserved protection was left to fate. In the silence of that age, your body had to grow used to deprivation at the very place that needed care the most. Another hidden corner of medieval women's lives, where silent endurance became a measure of strength that no one ever named. Amid medieval life, the thing you think about the least is exactly the thing you cannot avoid: going to the toilet. There is no bright bathroom, no warm tap water, and certainly no private corner where you can forget the world outside for a moment. In your era, a toilet is not a room. It is a vague concept, changing with the season, your purse, and sometimes the level of urgency. If you belong to the poor, the most basic need is managed with a small wooden bucket or a tub in the corner of the house. Each time you finish using it, you must carry it yourself to the backyard to empty it. And on cold winter days, the smell rising from the bucket is even stronger than the breath from your first exhale of the morning. You gradually become used to living with the smell, not because you want to, but because there is no other choice. Personal hygiene is not your own problem. It is the problem of the entire village. You often hear villagers say that the nobility have close stools, leather-covers toilet chairs with lids, sometimes lined with scented linen, but reality is far less glamorous than the stories. When you visit a castle on rare occasions, you have felt the heavy, foul air drifting from the small rooms hidden deep in the stone halls. The nobles' toilet chairs are tended by personal servants, but what those servants are cleaning is the same smell you endure every day. In crowded towns, especially in Europe from the 13th to 15th centuries, you see many people not bothering to find a bucket or a private corner. They step right outside behind their house or into an alley, finish their business, then splash the liquid onto the street. On summer mornings, you have to dodge puddles of brownish-yellow liquid beneath your feet, not rainwater, but your neighbour's gift. When visiting larger cities, you encounter another specialty, the bridges. If you walk along London Bridge, for example, you will see many people using the bridge edge as their toilet. There are no prohibiting signs, and people do it as naturally as breathing. The river below carries everything away, yet returns to the city a thick stench on windless days. You cannot escape it. You live with it every day. But more remarkable is urine, the very thing modern people avoid at all costs, being considered a valuable resource. Dyers use it to bleach linen, tanners use it to soften animal hides, and you, a medieval woman, also save it in jars to wash clothes, because ammonia is the most effective cleaning agent you can own. You dip your linen garments into the jar, stir gently, and smell the pungent fumes rising. But it is the only way to keep cloth white. As for defecating, for many villagers, privacy is a luxury. When night comes, you take an oil lamp and walk to the backyard. If it rains, you simply sit inside next to the wooden bucket, covering yourself with a cloth to lessen the embarrassment. If you live in dense urban housing, cesspits, communal latrine pits, are where everyone goes. The pits are dug deep, and every few months men are hired to climb down and clean them out. These men are called gong farmers, the bravest or most desperate workers of the medieval world. You have heard people say they were paid well, but they worked at night to avoid being seen, because no one wanted to remember the faces of the men who handled the town's waste. And yet, without them, the place where you stand would drown in unbearable filth. And then there is the castle toilet. It sounds luxurious, but when you look at the garderobe, the small recess in the wall used as a toilet, you realise the luxury is only in legend. You sit on a stone slab with a hole, and the waste falls straight down the outside wall or into a pit below. In winter, the stone is so cold it feels as though your lower body is freezing. In summer, the smell rising from below makes you hold your breath, and of course there is no flushing. You know you are living in an age where every bodily function must be hidden, yet there is no hygiene support whatsoever. The church says the body must be modest, but never teaches how to keep it clean. You feel both ashamed and helpless. Sometimes you wonder how anyone becomes accustomed to this. And then you realise because no one has any other option. Going to the toilet is not a private moment, but a daily survival lesson. You learn to go quickly, clean quickly, avoid smells, and pray for wind to rise. You learn to keep your long gown from dragging through dirty ground. You learn to avoid places where people often pour water. In this world, personal hygiene is a negotiation with nature, poverty, and technological limits. But you carry on. You live through plagues, live through winter, live with smells, with inconvenience, and sometimes with embarrassment you cannot share with anyone. You exist among these things as part of your world, without complaint, silently enduring like every other medieval woman. Perhaps the most frightening thing is not the smell or the lack of cleanliness, but the fact that you never had a choice. Yet that is exactly what makes your endurance so quiet and admirable, even if history rarely mentions it. In the old legends you heard as a child, medieval women appeared as graceful figures, flowing silk gowns, long glossy hair, hands pale as milk, footsteps light as the wind. But as you grow up, as your own body collides with the reality of the era, you understand that those images are beautiful only in imagination, while life itself is full of smells, full of dust, and full of things no one wants to acknowledge. You wear a white linen dress today, feeling its coolness against your skin, and then look down at the hem already speckled with dust after a few steps on the dirt road. White linen, the garment that made noble women look like angels, in truth was only the outer layer hiding everything your body endured beneath. Sweat, oils, trapped scents caught under the thick fabric, and sometimes a few traces you wished no one would see. Medieval noble women, those whom history describes as refined and pure, also carried body odours no different from yours. They simply knew how to hide them better. You once stood near the wealthiest lady in the region during a ceremony and saw her lift her silver pomander, a small ball filled with fragrant herbs, toward her nose. Not to release a pleasant scent, but to mask her own smell and the smell of those around her. In her private chamber, you once smelled rose oil soaked into the fabric covering her armchair. The scent of musk mixed with sweat and lavender clinging to her handkerchief. None of these fragrances indicated cleanliness. They showed only that she had to fight against a reality no one could escape. The medieval body was seldom washed and always trapped beneath layers of clothing. Her outer dress, no matter how exquisite, was rarely washed. Fabric was so expensive that washing it harshly even once could destroy the garment. You saw faint yellow stains at the neckline, folds under the arms hidden by lace or embroidery. But no matter how well hidden, the truth still lay beneath the fabric. And then the hair, that which legends describe as soft, shining like silk. You know well that, when brushing her hair, strands heavy with oil and dust fell onto the tablecloth. Hair washing happened only a few times a year, and each time she used a mixture of vinegar or alkaline ash that dried her scalp so much that a few days later it began itching fiercely again. A little rose oil was rubbed onto her braid to give the impression of fragrance, but you could still clearly see lice living comfortably within the intricately twisted plaits. And then there were the details posterity always overlooks. The cosmetics she used: lead powder to make the skin paler, a bit of mercury to erase freckles, and beeswax mixed with scent to make the skin glossy. You once saw her lips turn paler than usual, her hands tremble slightly and the skin around her nose flaking, obvious consequences of the toxic chemicals she applied daily. But in medieval society, ornamental beauty mattered more than health, and you, standing beside her, knew exactly what lay behind that beauty. Fragile, artificial, and sometimes dangerous. Not only noble women, even you in your small home, took part in that illusion of cleanliness. You hung a few sprigs of dried herbs, kept your few brightest pieces of linen for special gatherings, and braided your hair neatly to hide the days when water was impossible to reach. You concealed reality with whatever you could, just like the other women in the village, quietly and instinctively. Yet the greatest irony is that society demanded you look clean, delicate, virtuous, while giving you none of the tools to truly be clean. No antibacterial soap, no running water, no bath houses, no basic hygiene knowledge. You had to beautify yourself with whatever you could find. Flowers, oils, herbs, white cloth, and hope others saw purity rather than the truth beneath the fabric. Still, amidst the chaos, you found ways to survive. You learned how to brush your hair to reduce tangles, how to sun-dry your linen undergarments to lessen odours, how to use herbs to mask every trace of the body. You could not be completely clean, but you could create an illusion, enough for you to feel at ease, and enough to avoid the world's judgment. In the faint light of late afternoon, you look into the slightly curved metal mirror and see a blurred reflection. Not perfect, not completely clean, but still you. A medieval woman living amid poverty, superstition and scarcity. still trying to keep a fragment of dignity in a time that did not allow it easily. And so the illusion of cleanliness becomes your only armour, fragile, easily broken, yet necessary. Because in this world, sometimes appearance is the only thing you can control, even when the truth beneath is entirely different. Medieval women did not live dirty. They simply lived in a world that gave them no chance to be clean. The smell of sweat, the layers of dust, the tangled hair, the dresses that were never washed. None of these were signs of laziness or carelessness. They were the marks of an age in which the human body had to exist between poverty, fear, superstition, and absolute scarcity. In the darkness of small rooms, amidst the creaking of wood and the fading scent of herbs, you see them. The women struggling to hold on to the last thread of dignity with a bottle of herbal perfume, a tiny pomander, or the whitest piece of linen they owned. They were not trying to be perfect. They simply wanted to keep the small feeling that they still had some control over the world around them, even if it was only the scent of their body or the neatness of their hair. When you look back at that entire journey, you understand that hygiene is not just water and soap. Sometimes it is hope. It is the desire to be a little beautiful, a little graceful, a little human, even when life does not allow it. And from the very distant viewpoint of the modern world, you may smile gently, not because of the unusual habits or the unclean things, but because you see in them a quiet kind of strength, patience, endurance, and an unending effort to adapt. Even in an age where the body was always surrounded by smells and dust, they still kept their self-respect, by every means they had. And now, sleep well and make sure you have showered. Laughs,